だいまよりパヴァンスクデフ氏と語ろう、自然と調和する世界の作り方、自然の価値をいかに社会へ組み込むか、メディアやビジネスの役割を開催いたします。
I am going to speak with you about what is the role of the corporation, and especially what is the role of the media in this huge challenge that we have of sustainability. Marketing and advertising is quite big business. Advertising preys on human insecurities, converts them into wants, wants into needs, needs into demand, demand into production, production to profit. Finally, it's the profit that is driving this. I think of this in terms of the 4 M's. I just talked to you about the method of marketing, which is from insecurities to wants to needs, demand, production. Also the myths, the 2 big myths of marketing, which is that firstly, it's all about nature versus nurture. We the advertisers are not causing this. We are just expressing the opinions of people. But actually that's a myth. They are. The second myth is this idea of ethically neutral. You cannot be neutral. It's just not a concept that I can sympathize with. The third is the money. This is not a small business. Apart from the direct media ads of $500 billion, there's also a whole lot of other related spending, broadband, entertainment, cinema, publishing. If you take all that into account, it's 1.6 trillion. That's more than 2% of the global economy. There are good ways of doing this. This is an example of a single advertisement which was taken out by Patagonia. They took out a full-page ad in New York Times saying, don't buy this jacket. This is their most popular jacket. That is disclosure. That's ultimate responsibility towards the consumer. So you are actually telling the consumer exactly what it is that your purchase is causing. But will media and advertising be the only things that change corporations to deliver a green economy that achieves the goal of sustainable development? The answer is no. There are at least 3 other important things that need to change. To transform business for tomorrow's world, we also need to create rules for disclosing the impacts of companies, not just on a product, but by company, like what is the total impact of this company. You also need to have rules for financial leverage. And financial leverage is basically a complex area to think of, because it's not as if I'm saying it's a bad thing to borrow. In order to protect the shareholders' capital, unfortunately, when the market creates a collapse, when, for example, a bank goes bankrupt, like Lehman Brothers, then suddenly it's not the market, it's us. We must pay taxes to the government, who will then bail out this company because they have become too big to fail. Those economists who talk about markets and market disciplines and allowing markets to do what they want, why don't you allow markets to punish the misallocation of capital? Why do you go saving all these big companies when they are close to disaster? So clearly the markets are not deciding the right amount of leverage. That is not the case. In addition to that, very often we find that we are taxing the goods, which means hard work, income tax. Corporate ingenuity, innovation, enterprise, value-added tax. Corporate profits, corporation tax. So we are always taxing the goods, but we don't tax the bads. The bads are basically mining resources from the earth which are depleted, emitting carbon dioxide into the air, making use of fossil fuels. These are the bads. We don't tax those, instead we tax the goods. Actually, everything manufactured is sold at a price cheaper than its cost. Basically because you're not accounting for the externalities of a good. You're not accounting for its damage impacts on third parties. An externality is a third-party cost of doing a business. Like, supposing I'm a car maker. I make a car, I sell it to you, I make a profit, I'm happy. You buy the car, you drive it, your family, you take your family, your friends to places, you're happy. But the car that I made has emissions, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide causes climate change, so maybe your home by the seaside gets affected. Maybe your lungs get affected by the carbon monoxide that my car is emitting. So you too are suffering the externalities of a deal that she did with me. Right? And if you look at the total externalities of all the businesses from all the products that are made, people have done the calculation and they found the answer for the top 3,000 companies is almost $2.5 trillion, $2.2 trillion, which is about 3.5% of global GDP. If you take the externalities and value them for the entire corporate sector, that answer becomes something like $7 to $10 trillion. That's basically more than 10 to 13% of GDP. So these are huge costs which have to be recognized and have to be disclosed. So these are the sort of 4 areas of accountability in advertising, of creating rules for disclosing externalities, creating rules for and limiting the leverage that companies are allowed to take, and finally changing the manner in which we tax, which is we tax more the bad, we should be taxing more of the bads and less of the goods. These are the big changes we need to make. And finally, most interestingly, we can also measure and disclose externalities. This has to be done by the accountancy regulators, but today we are at a stage where we need to show them how to do this. And here's an example done by AkzoNobel, where they measured all of the impacts along their value chain. Impacts on natural capital, social capital, human capital, and financial capital, positive and negative impacts. This is for their entire Brazilian operation, which is 7 massive factories. And they disclosed it, and this was done in 2014. More recently, even in the developing world, in Brazil, a company called Amata, which is a sustainable forestry company, measured their impacts, natural capital impacts along the supply chain, social capital impacts, human capital impacts, and in financial capital impacts as well. And again, they have disclosed it, giving all the numbers. So today I would say to you that it is no longer good enough for the company, for any company, to just measure and report its balance sheet and profit and loss. It's not good enough to only report shareholder capital impacts, which is what profit and loss account is. You need to also measure and report stakeholder capital impacts, which means your impacts on physical, natural, social, and human capital. So I've given you 2 examples of what is possible. I hope that when I come back to Japan next time, some of you, maybe from this room, maybe from outside, some Japanese companies, will give me a 3rd example, and then I will talk about that one. Thank you very much.
次はダイアログのセッションに入りたいと思います。ここからは CI ジャパンの日々の方で進行させていただきます。
では質問をまず最初の質問を出してもらえますでしょうか。1つ目、これ自然資本という、今日これまでのところでいろんな形でご紹介してきたんですけれども、これ本当に実現可能なのかと。特に政策としてこういうことが本当に導入していけるのかと。
The idea of natural capital is not new. It's almost 40 years old. It is mainly designed as a metaphor, an economic metaphor, to explain nature's value in economic terms. Demonstrate the value to the policymaker of nature to the country, or to demonstrate the value to the business and to the customer and to the value chain to the businessman, because businessman is involved in all of these. So this is why we need natural capital as a concept, because it enables you to translate. It's a translation device. It's a translation device from the heart to the money.
政府としてすべきことというのは、そうすると将来的なその政策の方向性を明確に示すというのが私は一番大事かなと、いうことは考えています。そのあたりは後でパバンさんにぜひ、ご意見をお伺いしたいところです。
The question, if I understood you correctly, is what can the government do to encourage the private sector? And I think that's a great question. So today we have the natural capital protocol, and of course we have therefore the means for any company to measure its impacts on society, to measure its dependencies on nature as well. So the reason why they would not do that is because nobody is insisting, nobody is requiring them to do so. And to make it a requirement, you need a rule, you need an accountancy regulation. So I think what governments can do is to ask the accountancy regulator in Japan, in UK, and internationally, the International Accounting Standards Board, IASB. They should be asked to issue standards by which companies have to disclose their impacts. And this is only governments can do this. You and I will try, but they may say, no, we are too busy. Yeah. But when government tells the accountancy regulator, please, we want rules on this. We want all companies to report their impacts on nature on society, not just impacts on shareholders, then they have to do it. Then it's a rule. So I think that's what governments can do, and we should recommend to them that they should do so.
2つ目、自然資本や環境保全を謳っているのは、先進国であるということが多いということなんですけれども、一方で、同時に途上国の環境資源を使って破壊しているのも、先進国なんじゃないかという問題意識ですね。
そもそも途上国は今から先進国が歩んできた道を見ながら、それを模倣しながら経済成長をしていってるのにもかかわらず、そこに対して、その過程を通ってきた先進国が介入をして、彼らの暮らしを変更していくっていうところで、きつい言い方をすると先進国のエゴになりかねないんじゃないかなっていうところで、実際その辺はどうお考えなのかなっていうところをお聞きしたいなと思って。
So I want to look at a slide and show you this, which is a connection between natural capital and poverty alleviation. We looked at Indonesia, India and Brazil, and we measured the estimated value of ecosystem services in those three countries. But then we asked ourselves the question, to whom did these ecosystem services flow? Who benefited from them? So every time we ask the question, who is the real beneficiary, the most significant, for whom is this? The answer is the poor farmer. There is a huge dependency of almost 350 million people in India whose lives depend mainly on ecosystem services, on all of these farm economies. Almost 100 million in Indonesia, and in the northeast of Brazil, Amazon dependence, almost 20 million people whose livelihoods completely depend on these forests. So if they go away, these poor people will be losing not 10, 16, 21%. We recalculated it based on what is the household incomes of these poor people and how much of the household incomes of these poor people, the poor farmer, comes from the forests. That answer is not 10, 15, 20%. That answer is more like 75%, 47%, 89%. That's the whole point. That ecosystem services may not appear to be that important for development, but when you go to the developing country, if you are not looking at GDP, but looking at on the ground what is going on, you're looking at those poor economies and those poor farmers, they are hugely important. So if you lose them, you're actually destroying the GDP of the poor. This is why we feel that real development is not about destroying the GDP of the poor. It is about keeping the GDP of the poor, but adding human capital, education, adding human capital, health, creating equity and access, social capital, developing human and social capital, bringing it up to the level that it is there, which is so big in the developed world. You are developed because you have high human capital, because you have high respect and understanding and a society that works, social capital. It's not because of natural capital that Japan is developed, it's because of its human and social capital. That's what you need in the developing world. But that is the answer to that question.
Q3 は、プライベート vs パブリックキャピタルという質問です。ここは、私的資本と公共資本、これを合わせて、資産というふうに考えていくのが、自然資本の、ある意味いい考え方でもあるわけですけれども、それは問題ないのかと。
Today, like I said, 2/3 of the economy is private sector. Human capital is the biggest form of capital in society. Most of it is being created by training and development. In Japan, there are so many companies which are investing in training and development of their people. So most of the human capital must be created by companies. So it's a positive impact. So we can't only measure the negative impacts, but also the positive impacts. We can't measure only impacts on natural capital, but we have to also measure them on human capital. And most importantly, these are not capitals that belong to the company. Nature does not belong to the company, it belongs to the world. Even the employee does not belong to the company. It has created the human capital inside the head and the hands of the employee, but it belongs to the employee. And understand that there are aspects of capital which are not just private, but they are public, other aspects which are community. This is a very important point that you have raised in terms of how do we improve the understanding of people, of policymakers and of businesses about what are the capitals that they are dealing with. this is a summary of all of the capitals that we have. There are different kinds of capital. Physical capital basically means anything that is manufactured, including money. So things that are owned by private companies or owned by individuals. Then there are things like what I call health, education, skills. That's human capital. The individual owns them. Even natural capital like mines and fields for agriculture and private forests can be owned by companies, which can be traded in markets. Markets will trade private goods, but they wouldn't do that unless there was social capital even in the market, unless the rules and regulations were there in the market. Then we look at community ownership goods, things which are owned not by an individual but by a community. This includes physical infrastructure like community centers and schools. In terms of human capital, it includes the knowledge of tribal communities about the nature that surrounds them, which they own, and they will not tell you the secrets of their medical cures and so on, their tribal herbs and medicines. And at the community level, there are norms, very clear. The village knows what it can do and not do, what areas are shared and which are not shared. And finally, there are public ownership goods. Physical goods like roads and bridges and hospitals, which everyone can use, and nobody owns them, the government owns them. And then there are human capital, knowledge, which has been put out as non-patent knowledge. Wikipedia, for example. That's human capital that's in the public space. So this is public capital. So you see, public capital is really very important, whether it is physical or human or natural. And without the existence of social capital, which is a binding force, you can't create money with social capital, but without social capital, nothing would work. Right? If the society doesn't work, then nothing works. So it's an enabling condition. So they may not generate income on their own, but without them, the other capitals cannot generate income.
最後の質問ですけれども、これはコミュニケーションに関わるところです。自然資本の考え方っていうのを主流化していく人々に広めていくためには、どんなメディアを使ってどういう人たちにコミュニケーションをしていけばいいんだろうかと。
自分の周りに普段生きていて、自然資本という考え方が周りに広まっているとあんま感じられてなくて、それを今後日本で、特に日本においてでいいんですけれども、どのような層にどういうふうなメディアを使って広げていくのがいいのかなとお聞きしたいです。
だから新しい関係性を作っていくことで何か新しい問題解決がやっぱりできるのかなっていう感じがする。だから人的資本というのがすごく重要で、じゃないかと僕は思っています。その人が自然資本ということを理解する人が増えれば増えるほど、新しいプロジェクトが世の中にどんどん広がっていくんじゃないかなという気がして、今日ここに来ているという感じなんですけど。
Most of the purpose of natural capital is to communicate to policymakers and to businesses. I think there is no use telling Greenpeace about natural capital. They already know it's important. Nature is important. Those people are not the ones deciding to destroy the forest. Those people are not the ones deciding to dam the wetlands and convert them into parking lots. The people who decide that are the companies, CEOs, and the policymakers who give the licenses. So it's only to the company CEOs and to the policymakers that you need the language of natural capital to explain to them what these nice people already know. That's the problem.
Thank you very much.